In the vibrant, tumultuous tapestry of Hollywood in the 1960s, there existed a world where glamour and controversy intertwined at every turn. While the decade evoked images of dazzling premieres, iconic films, and transformative cultural moments, it also bore witness to darker undercurrents of personal strife, political dissension, historical tensions, and scandalous rumors that shaped the public's perception of some of its brightest female stars. This was an era marked by unprecedented social change, where the old Hollywood studio system was starting to crumble, and new waves of directors, performers, and cultural critics challenged traditional norms. In the midst of all this, certain actresses found themselves singled out, not merely for their acting talent or on-screen presence, but because of controversies lurking behind the scenes and beyond the footlights. They became, in the eyes of some, the most hated Hollywood actresses of that era. As we venture into this prolonged narrative, we will re-examine their stories, extend our perspective with additional layers of historical context, and strive to understand why these women, each with her own complexities and contradictions, found themselves at odds with fans, colleagues, and entire communities. No detail from their original stories will be removed, and yet we will add dimensions of depth, historical nuance, and cultural commentary to better appreciate why these controversies mattered then, and why they continue to intrigue and divide audiences today. Consider first the story of Natalie Wood, a figure whose Hollywood trajectory began at an impossibly young age, leaving her psyche entangled with early fame and burdensome expectations. She had emerged as a child star at a time when studios meticulously shaped young performers' images, often ignoring their inner turmoil. For Wood, whose family background and relationship with a controlling, domineering stage mother loomed large in her personal narrative, life under the spotlight never felt entirely safe. Surrounded by the intense glare of cameras and the manipulations of Hollywood's entrenched power brokers, she carried anxieties that stemmed from her youth. There are accounts, for instance, that as a little girl she would imagine her dolls as living, breathing confidants, whispering secret fears into their tiny ears and interpreting their silence as complex, if comforting, conversation. Such coping mechanisms, while imaginative, speak to a childhood fraught with internal unrest. One painful detail that arose early in her romantic life involved returning an engagement ring to her high school sweetheart, a gesture that underlined a theme: intimacy and security would remain elusive. Then came the morally questionable relationships the industry facilitated. During the production of Rebel Without a Cause, she became involved with director Nicholas Ray, who was decades her senior, an entanglement symbolic of Hollywood's predatory undertones, where older, powerful men often expected compliance from vulnerable young actresses. As Wood's career matured, her personal life offered no respite. She married actor Robert Wagner, a union initially perceived as a fairy tale match between two beautiful and bankable stars. But this fantasy collapsed with their split in 1961. Though publicly, Wood claimed responsibility for the breakup, many speculated that an alleged romance with Warren Beatty during the filming of Splendor in the Grass had fueled rumors of infidelity. This web of personal anguish and professional demands also emerged in her casting as Maria in West Side Story, which sparked a kind of cultural anger. Some felt that a non-Puerto Rican should never have inhabited the role of Maria. Hollywood at that time was rife with ethnic misrepresentations, and critics were quick to point out her perceived shortcomings in both acting range and singing prowess, especially since her singing had been dubbed. In retrospect, Wood became an avatar of an era's complexities, a star who embodied youth, vulnerability, and beauty, and yet also carried the burden of being an outsider criticized for appropriating roles. Her untimely death in 1981 cast a final somber tone over a life already laden with unresolved tensions. Another figure, who was no stranger to controversy, was Jane Fonda. Born into cinematic royalty as the daughter of Henry Fonda, Jane's journey took a path far different from what her early Hollywood image might have suggested. Her film career, launched in the late 1950s and blossoming through the 60s, could have secured her a permanent place as a beloved starlet. But the 1960s and 1970s were not periods of calm. They were riddled with the Vietnam War, civil rights movements, and a nationwide fractures in American identity. Fonda grew increasingly politically active during this time. By the early 1970s, she was an outspoken critic of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, aligning herself with anti-war activists and veterans who had returned disillusioned. However, the single act that scorched her name into the annals of cultural infamy was her 1972 visit to Hanoi, North Vietnam. Photographs emerged showing her seated at a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun, and rumors soon followed. Some even suggested that she had passed along secret messages from American POWs to their captors, an unsubstantiated claim, but one that refused to vanish in the public imagination. For Vietnam veterans who felt betrayed by segments of the anti-war movement, Fonda's image as Hanoi Jane became symbolic of an unforgivable transgression. She eventually apologized, but time has proven how powerful the emotional scars of war can be. Decades later, many who served or who lost loved ones in Vietnam still regard her name with seething resentment. In a broader historical context, Fonda's story intersects with the era's tumultuous attempt to redefine patriotism, and the line between valid protest and treachery blurred in the heated political climate. Her lingering vilification underscores how the deep wounds of national conflicts can overshadow any number of acting accolades or subsequent humanitarian gestures. Raquel Welch represented another dimension of Hollywood's complicated relationship with its actresses. Catapulted to global stardom for her role in 1 Million Years BC, in 1966, Welch's appeal seemed inextricable from her sensual image. Beauty, sex appeal, and a particular kind of cinematic female objectification combined to define her stardom. She fought privately and sometimes publicly against being reduced to a mere symbol of physical allure. Yet the entertainment world she inhabited consistently reinforced that her fame and currency as a star were largely tied to her looks. While she achieved critical recognition in The Three Musketeers and won a Golden Globe, she was never entirely free from the insinuation that her success was merely a product of her beauty. Her personal life, too, carried its own dramas. A notably turbulent divorce from Patrick Curtis left her with a nominal settlement of $1, forcing her to split valuable assets she had worked so hard to attain. Hollywood could be cruel, especially to women who dared to control their own finances and careers. When she married Andre Weinfeld in 1980 after vowing never to wed again, it highlighted the intense contradictions in her life. While adored by millions, she fought her battles largely alone, simultaneously benefiting from and resenting the public's lustful gaze. The context of the 1960s Hollywood, just beginning to face feminism's second wave, offers us a framework to see Welch's struggles as not just personal, but indicative of how the industry resisted female autonomy. For Sophia Loren, the narrative from the period is similarly intricate, though the controversies that surrounded her often related to questions of professional rivalry and the politics of star power. By 1960, Loren was a globally revered icon, She represented a new kind of European glamour in Hollywood, a merging of Italian cinematic heritage with the English-speaking film world. Loren's initial 5-picture deal with Paramount produced collaborations with Cary Grant, Clark Gable, Frank Sinatra, and other luminaries. Her performance in Two Women famously brought her the first-ever Academy Award for an actor performing in a non-English language film, earning her a place in cinema history. Yet tension simmered behind the scenes. Rumor has it that Charlton Heston, an actor of immense stature and pride, clashed with Loren on the set of El Cid. He arrived expecting to dominate the production, but found himself face-to-face with an actress equally insistent on a script and schedule that suited her needs. In an industry where male stars often wielded unilateral power, Loren's demands for script revisions, romantic scenes that highlighted her strengths, and a carefully controlled shooting schedule were unprecedented. The frictions that emerged can be seen as emblematic of the shifting power dynamics in Hollywood. More women, especially those backed by international acclaim, were no longer content to be passive objects in an industry still controlled by men. The resulting power struggle between Heston and Loren, hinted at by gossip of the time, was a microcosm of a broader cultural shift where women in Hollywood were learning to assert themselves, challenging long-standing traditions that had placed male stars at the pinnacle of creative control. In reflecting on Patricia Neal's experiences, we find another layer of the era's complexity. Neal's involvement in Breakfast at Tiffany's might seem a footnote to a grander cinematic history, given that the film is best remembered for Audrey Hepburn's iconic performance and Blake Edwards' elegant direction. Yet behind the scenes, Neal encountered turmoil largely stemming from George Peppard's behavior. Initially optimistic about working with Peppard, an actor who had shown potential, Neal discovered that he had grown arrogant, cold, and difficult to handle. Peppard's clashes with director Blake Edwards, which nearly escalated to physical violence, tarnished the atmosphere on set. Even Hepburn, known for her kindness, found him a challenge. Neal's blunt recollections reveal a reality often concealed by Hollywood's glamour: big egos, creative differences, and simmering resentments that sometimes made the filmmaking process a miserable experience. For Neal, this confirmed that even a role in a now-beloved classic could involve great personal cost. The open hostility that she and others encountered on set provides insight into the industry's macho undercurrents, where male stars often felt entitled to dictate production aspects. Her experiences fit neatly into a larger historical pattern. While the 1960s began to chip away at Hollywood's old guard, some vestiges of male dominance persisted, ensuring that actresses navigating these waters had to remain resilient. Catherine Deneuve's controversies spotlighted issues extending far beyond a single film set, crossing into the domain of politics, social movements, and the evolving discourse around feminism. Decades after her cinematic rise in the 1960s, Deneuve, along with 99 other French women, signed an open letter critiquing certain aspects of the Me Too movement, which gained momentum in the latter half of the 2000s and 10s. Though the Me Too phenomenon is modern, tracing its roots to the Harvey Weinstein scandal, it is part of a continuum of women's struggles for dignity, equality, and liberation that had been steadily intensifying since well before the 1960s. Deneuve's stance that the campaign risked becoming excessively puritanical and stifling dissent provoked furious debate. Critics accused her of being insensitive, out of touch, or even complicit in perpetuating harassment by minimizing its harm. Yet from a historical standpoint, Deneuve's view reminds us that the conversation about women's rights, oppression, and sexual politics has never been monolithic. Even during the 1960s, while second-wave feminism was challenging entrenched patriarchal norms, not all women agreed on the methods or the rhetoric of the movement. By examining Deneuve's position, we get a multi-layered understanding. Her letter's defenders saw it as a call to preserve certain nuances of romantic interaction, while her detractors viewed it as a betrayal. In either case, her involvement illustrates that controversies over feminism's direction and strategies extend back decades, evolving through cultural shifts and differing political climates. Deneuve herself, as an influential European actress who bridged art house and mainstream success, stood at the crossroads of these shifting ideological currents. Ann-Margret's story brings us into the realm of celebrity romance and personal connection amid the glare of the spotlight. Her relationship with Elvis Presley, described in her 1994 memoir, reveals a tenderness and mutual understanding that was not always visible to the public. In an industry that thrived on sensationalizing the personal lives of its stars, these two performers found solace in one another's shared backgrounds and traditional values. In the early 1960s, Elvis was already a musical and cultural phenomenon, and Ann-Margret, on the rise as both singer and actress, sought creative freedom and personal authenticity. Both struggled against the rigid typecasting that Hollywood imposed. Their quiet visits, familial dinners, and deeply respectful dynamic present a stark contrast to the lurid headlines and fabricated stories so common in Hollywood tabloids. That she would later declare never having recovered from Elvis's death shows the profound emotional resonance such relationships carried. At the time, with the world's moral landscape shifting, what might have seemed a conventional courtship shone like an anchor of stability for two people grappling with stardom's isolating effects. Their relationship enriches our understanding of how even the most idolized figures were human beings searching for comfort, understanding, and respect, a truth easy to lose track of amid the bombast of show business. Brigitte Bardot's controversies pull us into the domain of politics, culture clashes, and the growing xenophobia that plagued and continues to plague many societies. While Bardot's early fame rested on her sultry looks and groundbreaking roles, and God-created woman etched her name in cinematic history, her later years brought a reputation stained by anti-Muslim rhetoric, fined multiple times in France for inflammatory comments that targeted Islam and its followers. Bardot's legacy grew complicated and polarizing. Much as Jane Fonda's critics never fully forgave her Hanoi trip, many saw Bardot's remarks as a form of unforgivable hate speech. Historical tensions between France and its immigrant communities, especially those of North African and Middle Eastern descent, form a backdrop to her vitriol. While she became a champion for animal rights, a cause that earned her admiration from some, her anti-Muslim statements emerged in a Europe contending with post-colonial migration, the Algerian War's lingering shadows, and the rise of the far right in French politics. Bardot's alignment with the National Front's ideology, through her husband's advisory role, underscored the political shift taking place in Europe. The difficulty of reconciling her earlier image as a youthful sex symbol and cultural icon with her later status as a provocative polemicist lays bare a fundamental truth. Star images are never fixed. They mutate over time, and past adoration can turn to revulsion if the star's off-screen stance violates the cultural values of changing eras. Bardot's story reveals how actresses can be caught in the crossfire of broader historical and political disputes, their personal beliefs magnified to become national talking points. The clash involving Shirley MacLaine and Anthony Hopkins, although less politically charged, still taps into deep-seated discomforts and industry battles. By the time A Change of Seasons, 1980, came along, Hopkins was already a distinguished actor, trained in the robust British theatrical tradition, while MacLaine was a Hollywood mainstay, known for her distinctive personality, versatility, and willingness to push artistic boundaries. Hopkins, blunt as ever, later called MacLaine the most obnoxious actress he had ever worked with. Even though details of their on-set disagreements remain scarce, such a comment suggests a powerful clash of temperaments or methods. MacLaine, a member of a generation of actresses who had fought for creative respect and substantial roles, could be unapologetically forthright. And Hopkins, accustomed perhaps to a different style of collaboration, may have found her approach unbearable. This kind of mutual antipathy, especially in a film that was critically panned, exemplifies a painful Hollywood reality. Not all collaborations yield artistic harmony. The friction between MacLaine and Hopkins can also be understood within a broader historical frame. As actresses gained more clout and refused to quietly submit to male co-stars' demands or traditional hierarchies, this sometimes led to bitter conflicts. What might have been overlooked in an earlier era, when women had fewer industry footholds, now erupted into well-known controversies. By the time these stories reached the public, MacLaine, known for her spiritual leanings and outspokenness, had already become a figure who inspired either admiration for her candor or annoyance for her inability to conform. Hopkins's remark, preserved in Hollywood lore, thus symbolizes the tensions inherent in an industry that still struggled to redefine male-female working relationships. Mia Farrow's controversies pivot dramatically to the deeply personal and painfully private sphere of alleged abuse. Her involvement with Woody Allen, one of the most celebrated filmmakers of the late 20th century, set the stage for one of Hollywood's most gut-wrenching scandals. The public battle lines drawn within the Farrow-Allen family were neither neat nor easy to decipher. Dylan Farrow, Mia's daughter, accused Allen of sexual assault, allegations that resurfaced decades later, renewing debates about the artist's moral standing. While Mia and her son Ronan Farrow supported Dylan's account, another son, Moses Farrow, contradicted it, accusing Mia herself of abusiveness and manipulation. The complexities of these charges, countercharges, and their potential motivations have never been fully resolved in the public sphere. The saga became a symbol of how power, fame, and family can form a toxic cocktail. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about beloved cultural figures. The historical moment also matters. In the 1960s and into the 70s, Hollywood turned a blind eye to many moral failings and potential abuses committed behind closed doors. Attitudes towards child protection, domestic violence, and sexual misconduct were dramatically different then. By the time the allegations truly broke into public consciousness, the cultural environment had shifted. Audiences were less willing to overlook potential wrongdoing simply because a figure was a revered director or actress. Mia Farrow's predicament, caught between defending her daughter and facing accusations from her son, highlights how the sins and controversies that began in an era of relative silence can reverberate decades later when scrutiny grows more intense and unforgiving. In each of these stories, what emerges is a portrait of Hollywood as a complex ecosystem defined by ferocious competition, shifting moral landscapes, evolving cultural values, and perpetual scrutiny. These actresses, each singled out in some capacity as hated or heavily criticized, did not simply appear out of nowhere. Rather, they were products of their time, reacting to their individual challenges in ways that might have made sense within the historical context, even if posterity judged them harshly. For Natalie Wood, the pressures of early stardom and the inability to break free from certain preconceived notions mirrored Hollywood's exploitation of youth and beauty. Jane Fonda's transformation into a political lightning rod must be seen alongside a nation's bitter conflict over a distant Asian war. Raquel Welch's struggles with being typecast as a sex symbol parallel the budding feminist consciousness that questioned why talented women were reduced to their appearances. Sophia Loren's standoff with Charlton Heston revealed a nascent rebalancing of power between male and female leads. Patricia Neal's frustrations with George Peppard captured the old Hollywood ego battling new directorial visions. Catherine Deneuve's controversial letter decades later showed that the conversation about feminism's contours and boundaries remains messy and multifaceted. Ann-Margret's heartfelt connection with Elvis Presley offered a glimpse of authenticity and old-fashioned values in a world addicted to facades. Brigitte Bardot's inflammatory comments about Muslims exposed the ugly side of celebrity influence, tangled with the era's political shifts in Europe. Shirley MacLaine's personality clashes with Anthony Hopkins reaffirmed that not all iconoclastic actresses could easily coexist with equally formidable co-stars, highlighting tensions as Hollywood moved into an era of more overt female assertiveness. And finally, Mia Farrow's devastating family saga underscored the fact that private traumas, once hidden by the old Hollywood code of silence, could erupt in public view decades later, reshaping public opinion about beloved entertainers. By layering these stories with deeper context, one can appreciate that the hatred or contempt these actresses faced was often rooted in broader social, political, and cultural currents. The 1960s was a time when the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the women's liberation movement, and other upheavals transformed American society. Hollywood, far from existing as a pristine, isolated dream factory, reflected and amplified these tensions. The industry's rapidly changing landscape forced actresses to navigate treacherous waters. They had to maintain their star personas, tackle challenging roles, fend off exploitation, and sometimes step into political minefields in ways that male stars were seldom forced to consider. Simultaneously, these women had to grapple with the intense scrutiny of fan magazines, tabloids, and gossip columns eager to sensationalize their personal failings or perceived moral lapses. In hindsight, the controversies that once swirled around these actresses can be reevaluated. Some criticisms appear to have been unfair, rooted in the misogyny and double standards of the era. Others were grounded in legitimate political or ethical disagreements, such as the outrage over Jane Fonda's trip to Hanoi or the backlash to Bardot's xenophobic remarks. And some controversies continue to defy simple explanation, particularly those involving family allegations, like in Mia Farrow's case, where truth remains opaque and trust is nearly impossible to restore. Another aspect often overlooked is the way international relations and cultural exchange influence these actresses' images. Loren and Deneuve, as continental European stars entering Hollywood, forced American audiences and industry insiders to reassess comfortable notions of who deserved top billing, creative control, and narrative centrality. Their ascendance during a period of decolonization, the Cold War, and the sexual revolution cannot be viewed as purely cinematic. Political undertones shaped how their demands and desires were perceived. Raquel Welch's image as a Latina actress with a stage name that concealed her heritage reminds us that racial and ethnic tensions were also at play, influencing who was embraced, who was exoticized, and who is mistrusted. Similarly, debates over Natalie Wood's suitability for playing a Puerto Rican character in West Side Story prefigured the ongoing conversation about authentic representation in Hollywood, a debate that resonates strongly today when calls for diversity and accurate casting have only grown louder. In addition, the world surrounding these actresses was undergoing a radical technological and cultural shift. Television had emerged as a powerful medium that rivaled cinema for audience attention. The traditional star system was faltering, and method acting, new cinematic techniques, and independent productions began challenging the polished images studios had long crafted. As directors and writers explored grittier, more realistic subjects, actresses found themselves pulled in opposite directions, remained symbols of glamour and perfection, or embraced the raw authenticity that the new Hollywood demanded. These tensions often surfaced in personal controversies, where the friction between an actress's public image and her private life or political stance became a battlefield for cultural anxieties. Even the concept of hate in this context deserves reevaluation. Public hatred directed toward these actresses might be better understood as manifestations of fear, discomfort, or resistance to change. Jane Fonda's anti-war activism challenged traditional notions of patriotism. The resulting hatred toward her can be seen as a defense mechanism for those unwilling to confront the moral complexities of the war. Similarly, Bardot's hostility towards Muslims reflected certain segments of European society's fear of cultural shifts rather than some intrinsic evil in her character. If we scrutinize the emotional charge behind these controversies, we find insecurities about identity, morality, aesthetics, and social progress embedded within the public's reactions. The messy truth is that the 1960s, while often idealized as a time of liberation and creativity, was also replete with cultural clashes, generational tensions, and moral ambiguities. The actresses we have considered were not passive objects in this environment. They were active agents, sometimes complicit, sometimes rebellious, sometimes misguided, navigating a society in flux. They incurred the wrath of fans, collaborators, and entire institutions. But in doing so, they also forced the industry and the audience to confront uncomfortable truths. By refusing to remove any information originally presented, we preserve the integrity of each story. Yet we now see these narratives with additional clarity, placing them against a backdrop of historical upheaval and making them richer, more nuanced, and far more complicated than a simple label like most hated actresses of the 1960s would suggest. Each episode, from Natalie Wood's anxious childhood in the Hollywood machine to Mia Farrow's catastrophic family crisis, can be viewed through multiple lenses: psychological, cultural, political, economic, and moral. These lenses help us understand that controversy is rarely one-dimensional. It arises at the intersection of personal behavior, public expectation, industry politics, and the shifting tides of history. Viewing these stories from a modern vantage point, we might find sympathy where once there was scorn, or condemnation where once there was indifference. Above all, we gain insight into how Hollywood's myth-making machinery can elevate starlets to godlike status one moment, then tear them down the next when they fail to meet evolving standards or challenge entrenched values. In the final analysis, these women were human beings striving to excel in a field that demanded constant reinvention, while also navigating personal heartbreak, political maelstroms, social critiques, and the relentless gaze of the media. They inhabited a cultural environment rife with contradiction. Hollywood promised fame and adoration, but often delivered exploitation and resentment. The decade that framed their careers was similarly contradictory, pushing forward with social justice and radical change, yet always dragged backward by reactionary forces and old prejudices. The resulting tensions produced legends, martyrs, villains, and heroines, often within the same individual. What remains after sifting through decades of lore, gossip, headlines, interviews, memoirs, and scholarly assessments is not a simple ranking of who was hated the most, but a richer understanding of why these figures attracted such intense emotions in the first place. Their stories, extended and re-examined, become far more than just Hollywood trivia. They are keys to understanding the broader currents of the era, windows into the fears and desires of a culture struggling with its own identity. By adding layers of historical and cultural insight, we do not dilute the initial controversies. If anything, we sharpen their relevance. These actresses were not just names and faces on a screen. They were flashpoints in a dynamic conversation about what art should represent, how society should be organized, who deserves empathy or admiration, and who warrants critique or condemnation. Some soared to new heights of respect over time. Others remained forever tarnished in the eyes of segments of the public, and still others find their legacies in flux as new generations reassess their actions with fresh perspectives. As we conclude this extensive reflection, it is essential to acknowledge that Hollywood's audience then, as now, participates in shaping these narratives. People choose who to idolize, who to vilify, and who to forgive. Our evolving moral compass as spectators recalibrates how we judge these stories. Time can soften the harshest reputations or solidify them into enduring cautionary tales. Sometimes, long after the original controversies have faded, the emotional charge lingers in collective memory, a testament to the powerful interplay between star images and public sentiment. In an age when social media can turn anyone into a public figure and controversies travel at light speed, looking back at these 1960s actresses reminds us that celebrity scandal is nothing new. It has always been fueled by the era's anxieties, insecurities, and ambitions. If you have journeyed with us through these layered histories, perhaps you now see these actresses not merely as objects of scorn or awe, but as complex figures caught at the intersection of personal ambition, historical moments, and cultural expectations. By weaving in more historical detail, political context, and social analysis, we have tried to better understand why they, at times, became the targets of intense dislike or moral outrage. This insight deepens our appreciation for the difficult roads they traveled and the lasting impact of their lives and choices on the collective narrative of Hollywood and its uneasy marriage with the broader currents of society. The 1960s remain an era of seismic cultural shifts, and these actresses were right there at the fault lines, learning firsthand that fame and hatred can be disturbingly close companions, especially in a world as unforgiving, enthralling, contradictory, and eternally fascinating as Hollywood.